Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's happening?
Hey, Chris, doing good. Looking out through the window and finally the spring has arrived, or early summer in Switzerland. It's about time. How you been doing?
I am doing fantastic. You're right. I'm waiting for spring to really set in. I think on the Insider's Guide Instagram today, I posted a picture of me sitting by the beach, waiting for the beach to start. So I'm ready for the warm weather. But I'm equally ready for today's topic, because this is a topic that you and I have talked about doing for more than a year. We've wanted to get this particular topic on the show. I think this is our first episode on fusion on Insider's Guide to Energy. So I am really excited about this.
I think it is. As you mentioned, we discussed it a few times. We dipped our toe in other topics around it, but never really a full show around it. And for me, this is also a little bit of a new stretch. I don't know too much about it, so that will be really interesting to know more about it. But also it feels a little bit like the energy nirvana, doesn't it? You got abundant fuel, you got low carbon emissions and high energy. So this is like, is this the perfect solution? There's got to be something on the way there, isn't it?
I hope so. There's a lot of money and a lot of companies doing around this, but I also in the show prep watched our guest talk about the old adage that we're always 30 years away from this technology. So it'll be interesting to see if we're still 30 years away from this technology, or if she thinks it's already here and it's real or it's close. But rather than speculating, let's go ahead and bring our guest on and go from there. So I would like to introduce Melanie Windridge to the program. Melanie, welcome to the program.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
So you heard our preamble. We're really excited to have this show. But before we go there, we probably ought to tell our audience who you are, because they know we're going to talk about fusion, but they don't know why we invited you to be a guest. So maybe just a real brief background would be a good way to start.
Okay. Well, I'm the founder and CEO of Fusion Energy Insights, which is a company that helps people keep up to date with developments in the growing fusion industry. But how did I get here? Well, I started in fusion coming up 20 years ago now. So after I finished, I did an undergraduate degree in physics. And then after that, I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do with my life. I was traveling around a bit, backpacking and thinking about what my next steps would be. And I was already interested in, or aware of the potential energy crisis looming, the fact that we were going to run out of fossil fuels. I was aware of environmental considerations and climate change. And when I was backpacking, I sort of saw some of these things hitting me a little bit more, because I was doing things like hiking in the Himalayas and seeing glacial retreat. I was diving and seeing corals bleaching. And so I was gaining this increased awareness of issues. And some point during that time, I read about fusion, like clean, green, safe, abundant energy. And I thought, if we could do this, it would be incredible. It would really solve a lot of our problems. And so I came back to England to do a PhD in fusion energy. So that's where this all started. As I said, almost 20 years ago. And since then, since my PhD, I've been involved more in education and communications work. And quite soon after my PhD, I started working with a private fusion company. And that was in 2013. And they were pretty new then. Like, most people thought that the private fusion companies were crazy. And but it gave me a different view. It gave me a view from academia and science of fusion to the private companies actually trying to make a product. And then many years later, the private companies started actually demonstrating decent results, and the industry changed, and the Fusion Industry Association was formed in 2018. And I was the UK director of the Fusion Industry Association for a few years, which gave me a broader industry view. And so soon after that, that's kind of what inspired me to set up my company, Fusion Energy Insights, because I saw that there were these huge changes happening in the industry. It's growing, and there are there are people out there like investors or like supply chain companies or lots of different companies who might want to be getting involved in the fusion industry and who need to know more about it and keep up to date. So yeah, I think I have kind of an interesting perspective going all the way from academia through the private companies like out to the industry. So that's why I'm here.
Well, awesome. We are grateful to have you share your expertise with us on the show. I guess Johan and I, we have a famous quote where we say we like to ask the dumb questions. So I think that the first dumb question, rather than letting Johan, take the question, is what do we mean by fusion energy today, right? So we know what it means in like the science books or what we think it means. What does fusion energy mean to you?
So, fusion is what's happening in the sun and the stars all the time. And scientists are working to harness that reaction on Earth to make a clean energy source. So, to me, fusion is both those things. Fusion is the sun, but it's also the potential of clean, almost limitless energy for mankind. I think that it's a necessary energy solution. I think it's part of a mix because energy demands are so diverse. But I do think that for a long term sustainable energy future, you need something like fusion, something that produces always on, dispatchable, clean energy. And that can be used like around the world, like wherever. And I think that that's going to be really important for the long term to get us off fossil fuels.
And I notice you using a lot of future words, like it's going to be and things in the future. You heard my intro kind of making fun of the adage that I heard you say on a previous talk. So, but I also see 30, 40 fusion companies that I'm tracking or I follow. So how futuristic are we talking for this kind of energy?
That's a really interesting point because I often find myself saying like we need to stop talking about it as a future energy source and start talking about it like not as science fiction but more as it's a reality, it's coming, because I do believe that it's coming, but it's still not ready yet. It's not an energy source yet. It's still experimental. We're at that kind of crux point where fusion is moving from the laboratory into the commercial space. And so it is a crux point in that fusion is going to need support. It's going to need partnerships between the public labs and the private sector. But it's a really interesting period as well because yeah, we are moving out of the lab. We're moving from a scientific demonstration to more of the engineering side of things. So like how do we actually build fusion power plants that are going to be economical and we're going to be able to to run for decades. So we are still talking in the future because no one has yet made electricity from fusion, but we're hoping to see that like let's say in the next 10 years or so. The US have a bold decadal vision that they announced last year where they say that they want to see electricity on the grid within a decade. The UK now has a fusion strategy. The Japanese have just announced their fusion strategy. So governments are stepping up now and they're starting to say, it's not science fiction. We're going to make this a reality. But the truth is that there's still a lot that needs to be done to make it a reality. So the governments have to, put the policy incentives in place. We need to get investment. There's a lot that goes along with it.
But I think this is the interesting part with the whole energy transition, because especially now within, I would say, since we started this podcast, I think it's changed quite a bit. And you start looking more and more in investment into new areas. And we've had a number of those on the show as well. Many times led, as you said, by investment through governments. And we got the IRA, for example, in the US, and we have a number of European. But I'm a little bit curious as well in terms of you mentioned that the private or the commercial investments that goes into this. I can understand that from a government point of view, we're looking at everything, whatever we can now in this energy transition. Let's look into it and see what kind of goes. But private investments are usually a little bit more commercially in terms of that one and alongside. So if you have examples, or at least in terms of what kind of industries do you see are the main private investors in something that could be very long term?
Private investment has actually transformed the fusion industry, I would say, or at least is transforming it from the science into an actual industry. Because before then, like before the private investors started getting involved, it was really just government labs and government funding. And fusion progressed very, very slowly for a long time. That's kind of where that joke comes from, that fusion's 30 years away and always will be. My favorite joke. That's kind of where that comes from, because, like, to my mind, the fusion program has essentially been like drip fed for decades, as in it hasn't had enough government funding going into it to get it like over the threshold, to actually like demonstrate the science. Although that said, just last year, the National Ignition Facility, a laser fusion experiment in America, did actually get past a key milestone, which was something they call ignition. So it's a self-sustaining fusion reaction. And that's a really important milestone, because it means that it basically proves out the science. It proves that fusion on Earth is possible. And so now we need to move on from that and do the engineering work to get there. But so yeah, the private investment has actually kind of sped things up a bit, or like galvanized things, because first of all, you've got more money going into the field and more people are trying different things. But also there are private companies that are building on the decades of research that has gone into fusion, either on the laser fusion side, like the NIF experiment that I just talked about, or on another magnetic fusion side where there are machines called tokamaks, which are the most well researched. And so the private companies who are researching these concepts are building on decades of knowledge, but the private money is enabling them to bring in new technologies and do things faster. And so that's what's really led to like the changes in the fusion industry, really. The fact that we've got private capital coming in. Who is it, you asked? Well, it started off with like high net worth individuals, the kind of people like 10 years ago or more, who were like willing to take a punt on something that could be like very, very exciting. But as fusion has developed and as the private companies are demonstrating good results, you're starting to see like different investors coming in. Some venture capital, some like pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, oil and gas companies as well getting involved. So there's a real mixture, and it's exciting that we are seeing people, or investors rather, of like different categories of investors coming into fusion.
So I got two questions. The first one has to do, and I'll bring the second one afterwards, because you mentioned kind of some cool devices that they use that have been around, and I think that's amazing. But on the financial side, is fusion a little bit like other nuclear technology, where DOE, and is there a lot of restrictions between who can do this, or is this open science for everybody, and is it considered safe? I mean, is it something that governments are protecting, or are we helping everybody and jointly working on this?
It's very collaborative at the moment. Fusion was actually declassified back in the 1960s. It was secretive before then. Since then, it's been very, very collaborative. The science is very open. In fact, there's a big tokamak fusion project called ITER, which is currently under construction in the south of France. And that's a global collaboration. So people all around the world are working together to make fusion happen. Of course, once you get private companies involved, then things start changing a little bit, in that they have to protect some of their intellectual property. But I think that fusion is still very collaborative. So even the private companies, they work together where possible. The Fusion Industry Association exists to represent the voice of the growing industry. So there is a lot of collaboration, but the private companies are protecting their intellectual property. There are key technologies. It generally is not like the whole tokamak or the whole reactor scenario. It's more like key pieces of technology, which is where companies have the intellectual property.
And the second thing is exactly where you went with the tokamaks. Is I think it's pretty amazing how you can get plasma not melting down these things. Maybe for our audience, you want to spend just a little bit, like the 100,000 foot or higher view of what that is and what one of those does, how it works.
A tokamak. Yeah, okay. So there are different ways of doing fusion, essentially, because the things that you need for fusion, essentially you've got to make the conditions that you find in the center of stars in order to get fusion to happen. So fusion's actually inherently very safe because it doesn't happen naturally on Earth. You have to get everything perfect in order for it to work. This is also why it's very hard, but it's inherently very, very safe. So that's a good thing. But yeah, the conditions that you need to get your particles. So fusion is just the joining together of small particles to make larger ones. And so these particles in the sun, it's hydrogen coming together to make helium. On Earth, we use heavy hydrogen, like slightly bigger building blocks. It makes our life a little bit easier. That's the only reason why we do it. So deuterium and tritium. Anyway, so these particles have to come together, and the conditions that you need to get your particles close enough and hot enough for long enough for fusion reactions to occur. So those are your 3 parameters. But within these 3 parameters, there's a bit of wiggle room. So you can have, it could be a little bit colder but denser and fast, or you could be like a little bit less dense but hotter for a longer time. So you can wiggle around these parameters. So laser fusion is one way of doing it. She talks about NIF, the National Ignition Facility. The other machine is a tokamak, which uses magnetic fields to trap this hot fusion fuel, which is in a plasma state, just an electrically charged gas. And there are other ways as well. There are different approaches. But the tokamak is one of the most heavily researched approaches. So essentially, you've got a ring donut chamber with magnetic coils that go around the outside of this ring donut. And you have this hot fusion fuel inside, and the magnetic coils just make a trap, a magnetic field trap for the plasma, which pushes it against, like, away from the walls. Because it's not so much about, I mean, you don't want the hot fuel to hit the walls because it could be potentially damaging, but it's actually only damaging like cumulatively over time, because what happens is it just cools down, and you'll never get anything hot enough if you don't isolate it from the cooler surroundings. So in order to get those conditions, you need temperatures of about over 100 million degrees in your tokamak in order to get fusion reactions going. So you need to isolate it. You need to keep that fuel away from the walls, or it'll never get hot enough for fusion. So that's, a tokamak is one way of doing this.
And is that what the commercial companies are working at this phase? Like, so, there's numbers of them. You said there's a number of billionaires that kind of invested, and then there's more mainstream investment. And I think there's an investment event you're going to talk about a little bit later coming up.
Yeah.
But I guess, is that what they're doing right now? Because they're not generating electricity yet. So what do these companies actually do?
So they're making prototypes essentially, and they're all slightly different. So every single company has its own like niche, its own slightly different like twist on what it wants to do. So there are a couple of tokamak companies. There's one that I've worked for called Tokamak Energy, which is in the UK, which uses a tokamak concept, but actually a slightly more squashed up one. So rather than a ring donut shape, it's more like a chord apple shape. And this squashed up shape makes it more efficient. But they're also using high temperature superconductors as the magnets. And these high temperature superconductors are a key enabling technology for fusion. They've really changed things because they enable you to make higher magnetic fields. And if you can make higher magnetic fields, you can essentially make a better trap for your plasma. There's another company working on tokamaks called Commonwealth Fusion Systems, which is in America. It span out of MIT. It's the best funded fusion company that there is so far. And they're working on like regular shaped tokamaks, but also with high temperature superconductors. So between those two companies, there are slight differences. And then there are also, every company has a slightly different twist. There's another company called Type 1 Energy, which is using something called a stellarator, which is a bit like a tokamak, but it's twisted up. So it's like you wringing out a dishcloth or something, and you've twisted up your donut. I think they're also using high temperature superconductors. There's another stellarator company called Renaissance Fusion in France, doing things differently again. There are companies who are not using circular devices at all. There are some that are using like straight line devices and blowing smoke rings into the center, and the smoke rings kind of combine and you stabilize them using like beams of particles. There's a whole array. There are laser fusion experiments. There are experiments that are like laser fusion, but instead of using lasers to compress the fuel pellet, you're using shock waves. I mean, every company has like a different take on the problem, and that's a good thing. Like that is really like increasing the knowledge in the fusion space. So the fact that all of these different concepts are being researched and that private money has enabled all of this research to be done is really important. So to answer your original question, they're testing stuff. They're trying new technologies. They're building machines to see if they can get close to the conditions that we need for fusion. Some of them have. So as I said, the tokamaks have a lot of research behind them. So the tokamak companies kind of closer to getting to fusion conditions. Tokamak Energy's got to fusion conditions. Commonwealth Fusion Systems are building a machine at the moment that they hope will get past energy break even, so get more energy out of the machine than is put in about 2026. So they're all doing different things, but they're all basically building prototypes to try and get to fusion conditions and ultimately energy break even, and then electricity. That'll be the stepping stone, but you won't do it in one machine. It'll be a series of machines.
But it feels like there is, as you said, this not being an engineer or a scientist, I'm starting to get my head around how it works, and also the number of different ways of getting there. And it feels a little bit that, as we said, maybe not 30 years, but it's still in that early stages. But if we fast forward a few years, maybe not 30, but at least a few years, and we've had on the show new technologies. We talked hydrogen for a few things and on the show as well. And there is some dedicated or almost outlined deployment areas. Here's where we think the first deployment. Here we think is the first use case that we can start looking at it. Is this fusion development in the same way, or is this more generic? Let's get it to work and we'll deploy it everywhere. How does that work in terms of getting this from where you are with all these different tests? Once it works, is there a specific area where you think this is where it will start?
It's a very good question. And I think it kind of remains to be seen, but there are things to consider. So firstly, the majority of the private companies are targeting electricity generation. And I say that because fusion could actually be used for other things, which is really important, because the energy market, I think about 20% of the energy market is electricity. There's 80% of much more difficult to decarbonize energy use there. And so fusion could actually help to decarbonize some of these other sectors. It produces heat, so you can use that heat to produce electricity, but you could also use it to produce, say, hydrogen and synthetic fuels, or you could use it for desalination, or you could use it for heat for industry, provided you can get the temperatures right, for what they need. But the potential is there. And so that's a very interesting thing about fusion in the longer term, because it doesn't just have to tackle the electricity problem, it can really tackle the wider decarbonization problem. But in the short term, in terms of like the first usage of fusion, it will probably be for electricity. Most of the private companies are targeting electricity. And even within that, there are going to be markets that are, let's say, easier than others, because as with any new technology, the first one is probably going to be pretty expensive to build. Fusion is very complex. There are some private companies that are working to make simpler designs, but those ones have, the science is earlier stage. So the companies where the science is further down the track, the machines they're building are very complex and they're going to be expensive. So cost is going to be an issue, and obviously the private companies are working to get the costs down as much as possible. But there will be markets where the electricity price is higher, and those will probably be like the best markets to start with. For example, I think places like Singapore and Japan have quite high electricity prices. There may also be opportunities in, for example, remote mines where they need their own power source. So those will probably be the areas that are targeted first. But with the governments getting behind fusion as they are, particularly in the UK and the US, who's to say? It could be that there are policies that are introduced to make it possible. I can't really speak to that right now. We have to wait and see. But yeah, I think we're going to see how it shakes up over the next decade or so, I suppose.
So as this is working out, and before we start going into the details of the finance of this, are there pillars of the industry? Like if I was going to track the who's who, if I went to the nuclear industry, I could name a few names of the scientists that everybody knew. For fusion, who are the scientists that are leading this charge that I'd want to be following if I'm really passionate about this?
Oh, that's a good question. Because there are people in the public labs who've the experienced ones who've been doing it for a long time. I'm thinking of people like Steve Cowley. He's now he's the director of the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, but he used to be the director of the UK AEA, which is the Culham Centre for Fusion Energy, where the main hub of fusion in the UK. There's Ian Chapman is currently the head of the UK AEA at the moment. So there are scientists and people who are the leaders of the public labs, but then there are also the private companies, and I think it's very exciting to follow the private companies at the moment, because that's where you're seeing a lot of the changes, like the fastest changes. They're making a lot of progress. So I've mentioned some of the private companies already, like Commonwealth Fusion Systems, Tokamak Energy, First Light Fusion, ZAP, TAE, General Fusion. There are a lot. Focused Energy is a laser fusion company in Europe. I'd be following the private fusion companies. You can also look at the Fusion Industry Association. Andrew Holland is the CEO of the Fusion Industry Association. So that you'll get a lot of discussion of what's changing in the industry there. So those are the kind of places that I would
That
watch for
helps me
now.
quite a bit, because I just don't. I don't know the names to go to, but that gave me some folks to Google and follow, that if I'm not already following. Now,
Yeah, there are people in. I mean, of course, there are, like, you can look up the CEOs of those companies. Like Nick Hawker at the First Light Fusion is an interesting person to follow. He says some quite interesting stuff, and he writes a blog as well about, if you like the technical bits and pieces. And of course, you should follow Fusion Energy Insights, which is because we give lots of updates about fusion. So that's your first port of call,
well, but
That
that's
goes without
funny.
saying.
You brought
of
up
course.
Fusion X Invest event coming up, and
Yeah.
so we're talking about a technology that's going to need funding and prototyping for years to come, right? Before there's a return on investment. So how, and you also mentioned that mainstream investment is going into these long-term plays. Maybe describe a little bit what an investment event is for fusion, because that seems like a really long-term bet.
So Fusion X Invest, sorry, we're pulling together people from the investment community and from the fusion community, and we seek to explore some of these topics, like, what is the timescale to commercialization, and where does fusion fit, let's say, in an investor portfolio? How does it fit with other clean energy technologies, renewables, that kind of thing? We want to hear from fusion companies. We want to hear about investors who've invested in fusion. We want to talk about public-private partnerships and how the government is supporting fusion. All of these kind of things that come into, like, an investor's decision-making process, because fusion is a complicated topic. There's a lot to get your head around, and so for new investors, we want to help them, like, get a little bit of an insight into the industry. Of course, there's a lot of technical stuff that they need to get their head around too, but we can help with that separately. Fusion Energy Insights can help with that. But the event is really just to bring together capital and opportunity in fusion, get these people talking and discussing, because yes, it is still a long-term bet, but increasingly investors are coming in, and I think, the time horizon is shortening, not just because the years are going by, because that old joke of it's always 30 years away. I think it really is coming down because of what we're seeing from governments, because that's what it comes down to, the commitment from governments, and them saying, we are going to do this, we're going to put the policies in place, we're going to put the partnerships in place. Hopefully in future we'll see more, like, tax incentives and financial incentives. But the fact that the governments have a strategy and they want to see this happen, it is bringing down the timescales. And also, there are investors there. For example, some of the oil and gas companies who are getting involved in fusion, they're used to long time horizons. They're used to planning long term. So I think that there are a mix of investors out there with a mix of time horizons, and I think that we've already seen over $5 billion of private investment go into fusion, and that's increasing all the time. And so I think now is a really great opportunity for investors to actually learn about fusion, and then they'll be in the right place for when the right time for them is to come in.
This is interesting. You have this whole transition, and you mentioned quite a lot in the investment. Is quite of an interesting number as well, in terms that goes in already. And I guess with all the incentives that we've seen, and especially within the last 18 months in terms of the energy, and we see electrification coming more and more. Electric cars is exploding, which most people didn't even think about 10 years ago. So I think the time horizon on everything is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. One thing I'm a little bit curious on, we talked about investments, and you mentioned quite a lot of examples out of the UK and the US. I understand we're European and we're sitting this one, but you also mentioned the market that might need it the most, which was Singapore and Japan. Is that, how does this see? Because we see China, for example, with a lot of the solar and a lot of the EVs development and putting a lot of money into this one. Is there differences, do you see regionally in terms of development or investments from maybe North America, Europe, and APAC around this?
China's also quite involved in fusion. They just there was a technical, scientific record just a couple of weeks ago that they announced, where they have a tokamak and they like held their plasma steady state for a record of about 402 seconds, I think, which is about 6.5 minutes, which is actually a long time for fusion. And it kind of proves that you can hold it there like steady state. Anyway, so China are very involved. They're also involved in the ITER project, and they have private companies. One of their energy companies, ENN, has several fusion projects that they're working on. So so they're very interested in fusion. Japan also has fusion programs, and they're also very like advanced on the enabling technologies, you could say. They're working on, because this is another investment opportunity. It's not just about investing in the private fusion companies. There are a lot of technologies that are going to be needed in order to make fusion power plants. And so there are investment opportunities in enabling technologies as well. And there's a company called Kyoto Fusioneering, which is a Japanese company, well, international. And they're working on some of the technologies that you will need for fusion power plants. So, there is activity in Asia as well. The majority of the private companies are in the US. There's a handful in the UK, a handful in Europe as well. So, but it's increasing all the time. Like even in, like, you'll see the Fusion Industry Association brings out a report in like usually around July, and you'll be able to see like the increase in the number of companies. But I reckon that about half of the private companies in existence at the moment were founded in the last 5 years. So it's changing quite quickly.
So I also think that, I mean, you've written a few articles in Forbes about this. So if Fusion's making kind of a mainstream business magazine, this probably isn't quite as science fiction-ish as we think, because there's multiple articles that are in place on that. What about the individual? We talked about wealthy people. We've talked about pension funds or other places that have money. Is Fusion getting to the point where, if I'm a younger person and I want to make a long-term bet for retirement, am I thinking I should be investing in this, or is it still pretty high risky type stuff?
I think it's not possible just yet for individuals. You have to be a qualified investor in order to invest, because it's none of the private companies are like on the stock market or anything like that. You can't get involved without being a proper investor at the moment. There are a couple of private fusion companies have done like crowdfund type things, but it's very minimal. So for the majority of people, the only way to get involved is you have to be a proper investor. There's no way for the ordinary general public to get involved in fusion just yet, but that might change in the coming years. Keep your eyes open.
So we talked a lot about the investments. We went around the world a little bit in terms of where you see that coming from. I want to go back a little bit to what we mentioned in the beginning, and I think it's a question that probably needs to be addressed a little bit, at least, because we all have this short-term memory and long-term memories of the nuclears, and is that safe or not, and especially now recently when Germany shut the nuclears down, etc. So maybe for a layman as myself, how's it? We talked about safety, especially then for fusion. Maybe if you can just give me a very high level overview in terms of the differences and why this is safer, and this is the bet that we should actually do, because I think we don't want to come up with a long-term investment and then 40 years from now saying, okay, now we're going to decentralize, take everything down again.
Yeah. No, well, I'm glad you mentioned the safety side of things, because it is really important. And actually, so fusion is very safe, as I mentioned earlier, because it's really hard to do. There's no risk of meltdown. if the conditions aren't perfect, then everything stops. But also, fusion, it is a nuclear reaction, as in it happens like in the nucleus. Small particles form nuclei coming together to make larger ones. But it's the opposite of nuclear fission. So fission is the splitting apart of big, heavy nuclei to make smaller ones, and fusion is the joining together of small ones to make bigger ones. And the difference as well is that when you do fission and you split those big heavy nuclei apart to make smaller ones, the smaller ones that you get are still pretty big and they're radioactive. And so that's the radioactive waste that we talk about. And this radioactive waste can last for tens of thousands of years, and it needs dealing with, and it's a problem. Fusion doesn't have that problem because you're making really small things. So you're fusing hydrogen together to make helium. So it doesn't produce nuclear waste like that. Now, it does produce some nuclear waste, but that's the fact that the machine itself over its lifetime will become slightly radioactive. And that's because of the environment, because you've got high energy particles flying around, which can make the metals in the structure radioactive. But it's not a long-lived radioactive waste. It won't last tens of thousands of years. It would probably last like 50 to 100 years before it's completely safe and can be recycled. So it has to be decommissioned carefully, but it's not leaving a legacy of long-lived radioactive waste. There are some of the fuels, tritium, one of the fuels, is radioactive, so it needs special handling. It's heavy hydrogen, tritium. It doesn't last very long. It's got a half-life of 12 and a half years. So it doesn't last very long. And actually, it would be most dangerous if you ingested it. It can't get through your skin, so it can't do you any damage unless you breathe it in. So anyway, it has to be handled properly, but the risks are minimal. And actually, it's really important because the governments have been looking into the regulatory framework for fusion. And the UK was the first country to decide on the regulatory framework, and the US just a week or so ago has said that it's going to regulate fusion differently from fission. So the governments are setting out these regulatory frameworks, and they're assessing fusion on the risks of them. So they're not lumping it in with fission because it's completely different to fission. The risks are completely different to fission. It's a lot safer. So fusion is likely going to be regulated similarly to, for example, particle accelerators, or the kind of medical radiation facilities that you might have in hospitals and things like that, because the risks are no different, or seem to be no different than these sort of facilities. So it's like, the similar kind of risks to industrial facilities or particle accelerators or that kind of thing. So I think that's a really important thing, because having certainty on the regulatory framework and on the risks of fusion gives the developers certainty of how they're going to proceed, but it also gives investors certainty because they know that it's not going to add a lot of costs and timescales because of the regulatory bureaucracy, you could say.
Well, we're approaching time, but before we do, I have a question, and it's going to be a question of what was harder for you. Was climbing Mount Everest harder, or is it going to be harder to make this technology mainstream? Because you climbed Mount Everest in like 2018, if I remember.
Yeah.
So what's a harder challenge for you?
Oh, well, Everest is kind of easy in comparison, isn't it? It's very short term in comparison. Everest takes, a couple of months. Okay, it takes several years of preparing and training and things like that, but a couple of months on the mountain, whereas this is a much larger commitment, you could say. But but there are lots of similarities. You take things step by step, and you prepare, and you're agile, and you're able to to move with the conditions. That's all important. Funding is also very important. Everest costs a lot of money. And having the certainty of that funding is also important. So there are lots of similarities, but yeah, we're in fusion for the long haul.
Well, I really appreciate it. I'm going to let Johan have his last before I close up the program. Johan, any final thoughts?
No, as we set up from the beginning, we talked about, we haven't had this on the show before. For me, this was great. This gave me a real input into this one. And we talked about these 20% of electric today, but I think that's obviously moving higher and higher up. I think, we're looking at 50% in a short period of time, especially moving into cars. So once you have this, not when, but once this is available, we're really looking forward to, because it fills a need for this electrification as well. So I
Yeah.
really look forward, and thanks for giving us the name as well, apart from yourself, to follow, because I think this is going to be really interesting to follow, even though we might be early on, more on a scientific way than for me, that is commercial, but really looking forward, and really great insights. Thanks for having
Thank
me
you.
on.
I hope it's not the last time that you have fusion on your show.
No, this is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. I think this is the beginning. I want to thank you as well. Thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we have. I can see on the video, everybody's smiling. We are super engaged. We're excited about this content. So if you enjoyed it as much as Johan and I did, please subscribe, follow us, watch us on YouTube, watch us on Facebook. We look forward to talking to you again next week. Bye-bye.